In this age, the seeds of corruption were sown by America and cultivated by the Jews. Heading a capitalist financial system of enslavement, underpinned by a piece of paper called the Federal Reserve dollar note, which they alone printed and imposed on the rest of the world. After all their injustice and transgression, they foolishly expected to be left alone. The various kingdoms each used coins specific to them. This made the business of exchanging one coin denomination for another and charging a commission for the service very profitable. Furthermore, in order to attract gold and silver coinage, the bankers began to pay interest on coins stored in their vaults. The bankers, however, noticed that not all depositors redeemed their gold and silver coinage at the same time. This phenomenon would signal the next phase of corruption, which came to be known as fractional reserve banking. To illustrate, an individual deposits 20 gold coins with the bank on the condition that he receives 1 gold coin per month as an interest payment on the deposit. If another 4 individuals do the same, the bank then has 100 coins stored in its reserves. At the end of the month, however, only 1 individual returns to redeem his deposit of 20 coins, and to also receive his interest payment of 1 gold coin. But instead of using its own gold to make the interest payment, the bank uses the gold coins of its customers deposited in its reserve. So the bank is left with 79 coins stored in its reserve, and with the expectation that not all of their customers would return to redeem their coins all at the same time, the bank could then loan out a fraction of their coin deposits to new customers. They could, for example, loan 2 customers 20 gold coins each on condition that they also pay the bank back the amount of the loan plus an extra 2 gold coins as an interest payment. So now, not only were the banks accruing wealth from wealth through interest, they were now increasing their wealth with wealth that they didn't even own, because it was their customers' gold they were lending out and not their own. These practices in fact gave rise to the creation of what is in circulation today, banknotes. Initially, when the people placed their gold or silver coins in these banks to accrue interest, the depositor would receive a receipt or a promissory note, entitling the bearer to the amount of gold and silver coins written on the note. The note merely represented a promise to pay the bearer in coin the sum of the note on demand. The true wealth lay in the gold and silver coins and not in the note itself. The business of banking became so profitable that multinational branches were formed, vying to do business with merchants, from the merchants of Venice to the merchants of London. Here in London, the first reserve bank was established and named the Bank of England. But it was backed by the force of the English government, which institutionalized and enforced the usage of paper banknotes. Using the Reserve Bank of England as their model, the bankers further developed and proliferated this tyrannical system throughout Europe. 13 Common Era, the model was replicated in America with the establishment of the Federal Reserve. And like its counterpart, the Bank of England, the Federal Reserve was also a private corporation and exclusive banker to the government that was granted the power to print Federal Reserve notes redeemable for gold coins upon demand. So the gold standard, that is, tying the note to real gold, is what gave these fraudulent notes some legitimacy. Less than a year after the Federal Reserve was established, the First World War. Britain invaded Iraq with the help of her old proxies, the Rafida. The spoils of war came in the form of Muslim lands and the oil that lay beneath them. Finding inspiration in the Sykes-Picot Agreement, the Crusaders carved the Muslim lands into nation-states. America remained out of the fight until the end of the war. It chose instead to build its economy by manufacturing munitions and shipping them out along with other exports across the Atlantic to Europe. American workers were paid with a piece of paper, Federal Reserve notes, and payments from Europe into America with the true measure of wealth, gold. And to continue funding their wars, the Tawaghit of Europe abandoned the gold standard. That is, they broke their promise to back these notes with gold. As the notes no longer had any gold backing, the governments just kept printing more and more. In Germany, the sheer volume of banknotes increased by a staggering amount. When countries simply print notes irrespective of the demand for goods and services, prices simply rise. In Germany, bread that cost 100 marks at the beginning of the war rose to 2 billion marks by the end of the war. So the people of Germany not only lost their gold to the Tawarit, they also lost their savings because the mark just became another meaningless piece of paper. Soon after World War I, America also abandoned the gold standard on a domestic level, confiscating the American people's real wealth through an executive decree and ordering the American people to hand in all their gold. The Federal Reserve then printed new dollar bills and removed the words redeemable in gold. Now, on a domestic level, a Federal Reserve note was only redeemable for another Federal Reserve note. With gold out of the equation, banknotes now became the preeminent measure of all goods and services. The bankers had successfully replaced gold, which Allah created as the ultimate measure. Gold, real wealth that was toiled for and extracted from the earth's crust and sifted before being melted and converted into coinage, replaced by a piece of paper imposed on the people and printed at the discretion of the Tawarit throughout the world. Shortly after this great theft, the world was blasted by the shock of World War II. The warring nations yet again exhausted their gold supplies through war. But in the early stages of the war, America resorted to the same tactics they had previously employed in World War I, selling armaments, food, and other commodities to Europe in return for gold. With the great influx of gold from the two world wars, coupled with the gold confiscation, America now held a high proportion of the world's gold. It used this position of strength to organize a meeting in Bretton Woods with over 40 other nations. Here it developed a new banking and foreign exchange system post-World War II, called the Bretton Woods system. Under this new system, the Federal Reserve note would remain on an international level, redeemable for gold at a fixed rate of $35 an ounce, and the rest of the nations would link their notes to the Federal Reserve note. The Federal Reserve was now the banker to all the nations of the world. Countries therefore now had to accumulate dollars in their reserves in order to engage in international trade. And how did they acquire these dollars? They had to give America either their exports or their gold. In return, all the Federal Reserve had to do was print pieces of paper worth next to nothing. Filled with arrogance and brimming with worthless dollar notes, America now attempted to implement this capitalist system worldwide, beginning with the communist mushrik nation of Vietnam. But America's war with Vietnam exposed their fraud to the world. To continue funding the Vietnam War, the Federal Reserve printed and lent out more notes to the American government than it could ever redeem for gold. Nations worldwide began taking note of this fraud, and in the years leading to the end of the Vietnam War, they began exercising their redemption rights to gold, which resulted with the commencement of the flow of gold out of America. To protect their remaining gold reserves, the Federal Reserve counteracted with another conceded presidential decree, this time delivered by President Nixon, who annulled the Bretton Woods system by canceling all redemption rights to gold.
I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States.
This meant that the Federal Reserve note for the first time was no longer backed by gold on an international level. It was now just another worthless piece of paper. And because the dollar was no longer redeemable for gold, the Jewish former chairman of the Federal Reserve arrogantly proclaimed,
"The United States can pay any debt it has because we can always print money to do that. So there is zero probability of default."
In fact, following the Nixon decree, the amount of base dollars in circulation generated by the Federal Reserve rose from a little over $200 billion to over $2.5 trillion. And through the process of fractional reserve banking, this time under the Federal Reserve System, Banks are also allowed to create new digital dollars called bank credit against loan contracts such as mortgages. In fact, this is how most of the dollars in circulation are generated, as the graph reveals. Now, at the peak of the satanic system stands the application of the most insidious instrument, interest. To borrow dollars from the Federal Reserve, the American government first issues a bond, which is simply a loan contract to borrow a set amount of dollars and pay them back with interest. The Federal Reserve then purchases these bonds via private banks, and upon completion of this transaction, Federal Reserve notes are simply printed into existence. But when the Federal Reserve creates dollars against a bond, or when banks create dollars against a loan contract for that matter, only the amount of principal on the loan is actually created. But the loan has to be paid back with interest. So a question arises. If the banks are creating these dollars through loans, then where do the dollars to pay back the interest come from? The answer is they don't exist. For under this fraudulent system, the debt's total amount, the principal plus interest, will always be greater than the amount of the principal on the loan. Therefore, extra dollars have to continually be borrowed into existence in order to pay for the oppressive interest payments on the loan, as financial analyst Mike Maloney illustrates.
When your currency supply is all owed back plus interest, and the currency to pay the interest does not exist yet, it means that you always have to go deeper in debt. And so if the public doesn't always borrow more to cover the principal plus the interest that's owed on the currency supply, then the whole thing goes into a deflationary collapse.
This also means that inflation is an inherent and perpetual part of this evil system, as new dollars are always required to be pumped into it. Therefore, prices will always rise. The dollar has, in fact, lost almost all of its value since the Federal Reserve came into existence. To put this into perspective, a loaf of bread that cost 6 cents at the time of the Federal Reserve's inception today costs over $1.50. That's a price increase of over 2,200%. As Ron Paul points out, this is plain theft because it robs the people of their savings.
There's a dollar crisis out there, and people's money is being stolen. People who have saved, they're being robbed. I mean, if you have a devaluation of the dollar at 10%, people have been robbed of 10%.
Now, with so many dollars being generated, a couple of important questions arise. Why isn't America feeling the effects of inflation more sharply than it is? And why does there continue to remain a demand for these fraudulent notes? The answers lie in linking the dollar to a commodity that no nation could effectively function without. Referred to by Americans as black gold, this commodity is oil. It is the lifeblood of all economies, fueling motor vehicles, power plants, and factories. And it also helps protect these countries by fueling their war machines. Accordingly, the demand for oil will always be high, and so too, as a result, the demand for US dollars. Therefore, following the Nixon decree, the American government directed their puppet Taghut, the Saudi government, to use its strong influence in OPEC, whose membership is comprised of the leading oil-producing nations, to manipulate oil prices and ensure that oil would only be sold in Federal Reserve dollars. In return, America would continue to militarily and politically support the Taghut regime. These agreements came to be known as the petrodollar system. This system firstly meant that America, directed by the Federal Reserve, could simply print dollars worth no more than the paper they were printed on in order to purchase oil, which the Tawaghit stole from the Muslims and which should have been sold for gold. Secondly, as nations now required US dollars to purchase oil, America could also ship its inflation overseas. As financial commentator Edward Griffin highlights,
a good chunk of the money that the Fed created has been shipped overseas. I remember early in my research, I heard this expression that the Americans have exported their inflation. I thought, What is that? How can you export your inflation? Put it in a box and send it out? What do you do? Well, now I understand. You export your inflation by simply sending all these dollars that you created to these other countries, and then they send you their refrigerators and their cars and whatever, their TV sets. So you get hardware, and they get little pieces of paper. It's a great deal for the American people.
And even if countries weren't swapping exports for dollars, they still nonetheless had to hold Federal Reserve dollars in order to purchase oil and trade internationally, which meant these dollars remained outside America. Thirdly, the petrodollar system aided America in getting away with continually spending more than it could earn. To illustrate, America's revenue last year was $3 trillion. Its expenses, however, were $3.5 trillion, a difference of $500 billion. So to pay for this huge difference, America issues bonds to borrow the extra dollars it needs. This is called deficit spending. So how does America continue to get away with this deficit spending while also maintaining an enormous trade deficit? Again, the answer lies in the petrodollar system. The petrodollar system created a high demand for US dollars, which in turn made US bonds very marketable. To illustrate the implications of this benefit, China sends their exports to America in return for US dollars, which then pile up in China's dollar reserves. But instead of letting these dollars simply sit there, China uses a large proportion of them to purchase US bonds, which pay interest. So the dollars return back to America, and America then reuses them to purchase even more imports. So in the end, the dollars remain largely outside of America, and America can always spend more than it could ever earn, without sharply feeling the effects of inflation. The big irony is that under the petrodollar system, the Saudi and other Arab apostate governments, who already owned the oil, were nonetheless required to use a large part of their oil revenue to also purchase US bonds which pay interest, thereby also allowing America to reuse these dollars to purchase more imports or further build its military capabilities. In fact, the amount of American bonds alone held by the nations of the world is staggering, with China owning the largest piece of the pie. But the petrodollar system that helps sustain America's bond market and allows the Tawagid to continue plundering the resources of the Muslims is also their Achilles heel. When struck, it will mark the death of this oppressive banknote and bring America, the symbol of injustice and tyranny, to her knees. For this system, born out of the tyranny of banks and established upon the foundation of interest, together with the nation that it funds, will be destroyed on the same usurious foundation upon which it was established. There are two key manifestations of America's financial vulnerability. Firstly, if dollars are not continuously pumped into the system to pay for the interest on bank loans, their entire fraudulent system will collapse on itself. Secondly, with the current upheaval of the geopolitical landscape, major nations, led by Russia and China, have already demonstrated their willingness and ability to strategically attack the petrodollar system and US bond market by simply dumping US bonds, as financial analyst Jim Rickards highlights.
A lot of US debt is owned by foreigners. Who owns it? China, Russia, other countries that are not necessarily our friends, but they can dump it when they want to. Well, guess what? That's actually what's been going on. Recently, foreign holdings of US government debt have been plummeting. Here's Russia dumping treasuries month after month. That was a clear signal that they were getting ready to do something to engage in financial warfare against the United States.
When nations begin dumping US bonds, the real consequences of borrowing on interest will be felt, as Rickards continues.
Foreigners are now dumping treasuries, and if no one buys it, guess what? Interest rates go up. That'll sink the stock market. That'll sink the housing market. Higher interest rates mean the debt gets higher, so interest rates go up some more, so you start a death spiral and there's no way out of it.
And when the petrodollar system is shattered and nations begin clearing US dollars from their reserves, the value of the US dollar will also fall, as financial analyst Griffin emphasizes.
When the time comes, as it looks like it's now coming, when the rest of the world is saying, we don't want to play this game anymore, those dollars start to come back to America. People, we don't want them anymore. What do we do with them? Once this revs up and we've got this this little trickle of money coming back that we previously exported, once it becomes a flood and it starts to rush back, now we are getting our former exported inflation brought back to us. And then we'll see the quantity of money inside the United States grow much more rapidly even than the Federal Reserve can create it, because we're getting a previous money back. And that's when we will really see the tanking of the US dollar in terms of what it will buy.
But at the same time, the other Taghut nations cannot move too quickly, as they also benefit from this system by printing their own fraudulent notes. So they play a waiting game, holding out for the geopolitical or economic trigger that will bring about the ultimate collapse of the dollar, while taking measures to protect themselves by returning to and stockpiling the world's only true measure of wealth and the ultimate medium of exchange, gold, as the following graphs illustrate.